There are some voices a person never forgets, and on the night of the great storm, when Sister Clara knelt in the old wooden confessional of St. Aldous Convent and heard the stranger on the other side of the screen begin to speak, the voice that reached her through the dark was one she knew better than her own prayers, because it belonged to a dead man, a man the entire village had watched die in the town square 40 years before, and she had been standing in the front row when it happened. My name is not important yet, but this story is, and before I tell you what that voice said next, I need you to do one thing for me, because I only share hidden stories like this one here on The Secret Nun, and if you love true stories about brave nuns, wartime secrets, and the impossible things people survive, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because what you are about to hear has never been told this way anywhere else. Sister Clara had lived at St. Aldous for more than 3 decades, and in all that time her days had been so quiet and so ordered that she could set her life to the ringing of the chapel bell, the soft scratch of a broom across stone, the slow turning of seasons outside the convent walls, and she had made her peace with that quiet, which is to say she had buried the girl she used to be so deep inside herself that even she sometimes forgot the girl had ever existed at all. But peace, she had learned, is not the same thing as forgetting, because forgetting lets you sleep, while peace only teaches you how to stand very still beside the thing you can never let go of, and Sister Clara had spent 40 years standing very still beside the memory of a single day. The storm had come down out of the mountains without warning, the way storms always came to that little valley, and the wind had been beating against the convent's heavy door for hours, so when the knocking started, deep and slow and desperate, Sister Clara thought at first that it was only a branch thrown against the wood, or the thunder playing tricks on her ears. But the knocking came again, and there was a human weight behind it, so she lifted her lantern and crossed the cold stone floor and pulled the great door open just enough to see the man standing in the rain. He was old, that was the first thing she saw, old and thin and soaked through to the bone, and he was bent over as if the years themselves had been stacked on his shoulders, and when he lifted his face to the lantern light she saw eyes that were sunken and tired and full of something she could not name, and he said to her, in a voice cracked like old leather, that he had come a very long way because he needed to make a confession, and that he did not think he would live to see the morning. A nun does not turn away a dying man, not even in a storm, not even in the middle of the night, and so Sister Clara helped him inside, and she settled him on the bench in the small side chapel, and she brought him a cup of warm water and a dry blanket, and all the while she kept her voice low and gentle because that is what she had been taught, and because kindness, she believed, was the only honest answer to the sight of a man broken by time. But it was not until the two of them were alone in the dark, with only the lantern burning between them and the storm still howling at the windows, that the old man finally looked at her and said that he needed to tell her the truth before it was too late, and then he asked her a question that made the blood slow in her veins, because he asked if she had ever heard of a village called Marlowe's Hollow, and Sister Clara went very, very still. Marlowe's Hollow was the place where she had been born, the place where she had grown up, the place she had fled from in her grief and never once spoken of to another living soul in all her years behind these walls, and hearing that name fall from a stranger's mouth in the middle of a storm felt like a hand reaching out of the past and pressing against her heart, and for a long moment she could not breathe, and she could not speak, and she could only sit there and listen as the old man, without waiting for her answer, began to tell her the story of a boy he had once known. He told her that before the war came, Marlowe's Hollow was the kind of village where nothing ever happened, a little cluster of stone houses at the end of a valley road, with a church in the middle and a river at the edge and fields that turned gold in the summer, and everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew everyone's business, and the people there believed that the worst thing that could ever reach them was a hard winter, because they were too small and too far from anything to matter to the wider world. But the war had a way of finding small places, he said, and when the soldiers came they came in trucks, and they took the best houses for their officers, and they put their boots on everything the village had ever loved, and the people of Marlowe's Hollow learned very quickly that there are two kinds of courage in this world, the loud kind that makes speeches, and the quiet kind that simply refuses to kneel. And it was in those years, he said, that a young man rose up from among them, a boy everyone knew, the kind of boy who had been climbing the church roof as a child and stealing apples from the orchard and making the whole village laugh with his easy smile, and that boy's name was Anton, and Anton had decided that he would not kneel. Sister Clara's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against her knees to steady them, because she knew this story, she knew it better than almost anyone alive, and yet she could not stop the old man from telling it, because the way he told it was wrong in a way she could not yet name, And something in the back of her mind was beginning to whisper that she should stand up and walk away before it was too late. But she did not stand up, and she did not walk away, because a nun does not abandon a man who has come to her in his final hours, and because some part of her, the part that had been asleep for 40 years, was waking up and demanding to hear the rest. Anton, the old man went on, had begun by doing small things at first, passing messages between the farms, hiding food for the families who had none, carrying letters from the resistance cell in the next valley, and it had all felt like a game to him, a dangerous game, the kind that makes a young man's heart beat fast and makes him believe he is invincible, because that is the one lie that every young man tells himself, that the bullet meant for someone else will always miss him. And for a long time, the old man said, the lie held, and Anton moved through the countryside like a ghost, and the soldiers never caught him, and the resistance grew stronger because of him, and there was even a girl from the village who had loved him since they were children, and Anton had promised her that when the war was over he would build her a house on the hill above the river and fill it with light. Sister Clara felt those words land inside her like a stone dropped into deep water, because she was that girl, she had been that girl once, and the house on the hill above the river was the dream she had carried in secret for so many years that it had worn a groove in her soul, and hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger in the dark made her want to weep and scream in the same breath. But she did neither, because the old man was still talking, and his voice had begun to change, growing slower and heavier, as if each word was a stone he had carried up a hill for 40 years and was only now setting down. Then came the winter, he said, the winter the village would never forget, when someone, a farmer's son who had been beaten until he broke, gave the soldiers the one name they had been hunting for, and the soldiers came for Anton in the grey light of a December morning, and they dragged him out of his mother's house in front of the whole street, and the entire village was ordered to gather in the square the next day, because the officers had decided that an example would be made. And here the old man's voice broke for the first time, and he said that he remembered that morning better than he remembered his own name, that he remembered the way the square had been packed with silent, terrified people, that he remembered the soldiers in a line and the officer reading out the sentence in a bored voice, that he remembered the boy standing on the platform with his chin lifted and his eyes searching the crowd, and then the old man said something that made the lantern flame seem to flicker, because he said that the boy's eyes had been searching for one face in particular, and when they found it, the boy had smiled. Sister Clara could not stop the tears now, and they fell down her face in the dark, because she knew with the certainty of a woman who had lived inside that memory for 4 decades, that the boy on the platform had smiled at her, that he had smiled at her as if to say, do not look away, do not be afraid, it is only me, and she had been too young and too broken to understand that a boy being marched to his death would spend his last smile on her. The old man described the rest in a voice that was barely above a whisper, the way the crowd had watched, the way no one had been allowed to turn their heads, the way the sound of the single shot had rolled across the square and up into the hills and then disappeared into the cold December air, and the way the body had fallen, and the way the whole village had watched that boy die, every single one of them, because they had been forced to, and because the soldiers had wanted them to carry the image of it forever, so that no one would ever again be foolish enough to refuse to kneel. And Sister Clara had been there, in the front row, and she had watched the man she loved fall, and something inside her had fallen with him, and that was the day she stopped being the girl from Marlowe's Hollow and began the long, slow walk toward becoming the woman who now sat in the dark listening to a stranger tell her own grief back to her. But then the old man said the words that changed everything, because he said, very softly, that the boy on the platform was not the one who died. The room seemed to grow colder, and the storm outside seemed to pause in its fury, as if even the wind had stopped to listen, and Sister Clara heard herself ask, in a voice that did not sound like her own, what he meant, and the old man lifted his tired eyes and said that Anton had not died in the square that day, that the man everyone had watched fall was someone else, and that the truth of what really happened had been buried under 40 years of silence, and that he had carried the weight of it every single day since. He explained, slowly and painfully, that after Anton was taken, he had been thrown into a cell at the edge of the village, a cold stone room with one high window and a floor of packed dirt, and there had been another man in that cell with him, a man named Joseph, a quiet, gentle man from a town in the north who had been caught carrying a forbidden radio and was waiting for the same fate, and the two of them had spent their last days together talking in the dark, sharing what little food they had, telling each other about the people they loved and the lives they had hoped to live. And Joseph, the old man said, was a man who had already lost everything. His wife and his daughter had been taken in the first year of the war and he had never seen them again, and he had told Anton that he had nothing left to live for, that his own death was already a settled thing in his heart, and that if one of them was going to be dragged into the square as a warning to the village, then it should not be the boy who still had a girl waiting for him and a country that still needed him. At first, the old man said, Anton had refused, he had raged against it, he had sworn that he would never let another man die in his place, but Joseph had been calm, and Joseph had been patient, and Joseph had spoken to him the way a father speaks to a frightened child, telling him that the resistance needed its couriers, that the village needed its hope, that the girl on the hill needed her future, and that a dead man who has nothing left to lose is the only person in the world who can truly choose his own ending. And so, on the last night, the old man said, they had made the exchange, and the soldiers had been drunk and careless and they had not looked closely enough at the man they pulled from the cell in the grey dawn, and when the platform was raised in the square, it was Joseph who stood there in the dawn light, and it was Joseph who lifted his chin and searched the crowd, and when the shot rang out, it was Joseph who fell. Sister Clara sat frozen, because the old man had described her own memory perfectly, the lifted chin, the searching eyes, the smile, and yet now the meaning of every detail had been turned inside out, and the boy who had smiled at her in the square had not been the boy she loved at all, and the man she had grieved for 40 years had been alive the whole time, and she did not know whether to feel joy or rage or both, and in that moment the two feelings were so tangled inside her that she could not tell where one ended and the other began. And then the old man said, in a voice so low it was almost a prayer, that Anton had escaped into the hills that morning while the whole village was watching Joseph die in his name, and Anton had gone on fighting, and Anton had survived the war, and Anton had built a quiet life far away, and Anton had told himself, year after year, that one day he would go back and set the record straight, that he would find the girl on the hill and tell her the truth, that he would honor the man who had died in his place, but the years had turned into decades, and the courage he had shown in the war had deserted him the moment the war was over, and shame, it turned out, was a heavier chain than any soldier had ever put on him. He stopped then, and the silence between them was so deep that Sister Clara could hear her own heart beating, and she realized with a kind of cold clarity that she was not listening to a stranger at all, that she was listening to Anton, that the dying man on the other side of the screen was the boy she had loved, grown old and broken and bent by a guilt he had carried for 40 years, and the voice she had recognized at the very first word had been recognized by her heart before her mind had been willing to admit it. And so she did the only thing she could do, and she spoke his name, very softly, into the dark, and she said, Anton, and the old man went still as stone, and then he asked, in a voice that was suddenly small and terrified, how she knew his name, and Sister Clara answered him the way only she could, and she told him that she knew his name because she was the girl on the hill, because she was the one he had smiled at in the square, because she was the reason a good and gentle man named Joseph had lifted his chin and walked onto that platform, and because she had watched that death with her own eyes and had carried it with her into every prayer she had ever spoken. The sound that came out of the old man then was not quite a sob and not quite a word, it was the sound a person makes when a wound they thought had scarred over is torn open all at once, and he began to speak, faster now, the words tumbling over each other, saying her name again and again as if he could not believe it, saying that he had searched for her after the war, that he had come back to Marlowe's Hollow only once and had been told she was gone, that no one knew where she had gone, that he had carried her face in his mind every single day for 40 years, and that he had come to this convent in the storm not knowing she was here, not knowing anything except that he was dying and that he needed to confess before it was too late. And then he asked her the question that he had come all this way to ask, the question that had been burning in him for 4 decades, and he asked her if she could ever forgive him, and Sister Clara sat in the dark for a long, long time, because she had spent 40 years learning that forgiveness is not a word you say, it is a weight you choose to carry for someone else, and she was not sure, even now, whether she was strong enough to carry it for him. She thought about the girl she had been, the girl who had stood in the square and watched the man she loved fall, and she thought about the woman she had become, the woman who had spent her life learning that mercy is the hardest thing in the world precisely because it asks you to love the person who broke you, and she thought about Joseph, the man whose name she had never known until this very night, the man who had given everything so that the boy she loved could live, and she understood, in that moment, that her grief had never truly been her own, because it belonged to Joseph too, and to Anton, and to everyone who had ever been forced to stand in a village square and watch And so she made her choice, and she told Anton that forgiveness was not hers to keep, and then she did something she had never done in 40 years, and she rose from her place behind the screen and walked around to where he sat, and she let him see her face in the lantern light, the face that had once been young and full of hope and was now lined with the same years that had lined his, and she looked at the boy she had loved and lost and found again, and she said to him that the man who died in his place had a name, and his name was Joseph, and she would spend the rest of her days making sure that name was remembered. Then she placed her hand on his, and she told him that he was forgiven, not because it was easy, and not because it was fair, but because she had spent a lifetime learning that the only thing heavier than carrying mercy is carrying the refusal of it, and she would not let him die with that weight still on his chest. The old man wept then, the way a man weeps only when he has carried a secret for so long that releasing it feels like drowning and breathing at the same time, and he told her that he had loved her from the moment they were children, and that he had never stopped, not for a single day, and she told him that she knew, and that she had known it all along, and that some things, even death itself, had never been able to take from her. He died a few hours later, just as the storm was breaking and the first grey light of morning was beginning to show through the chapel windows, and he died the way every person hopes to die, not afraid, and not alone, with his hand still resting in the hand of the woman who had loved him, and the last thing he said, very quietly, was that he could finally see the house on the hill above the river, and that it was full of light. Sister Clara buried his body in the convent's small cemetery, and she did not tell the other sisters the whole truth of who he had been, because some secrets belong only to the people who lived them, and some mercies are too fragile to be spoken aloud, but she did one thing that no one understood, and she insisted that a small stone be placed at the head of his grave, and on that stone she had carved 2 names instead of one, the name Anton, and the name Joseph, because she would not let the man who had died in the square be forgotten, and she would not let the boy who had lived be separated from him again, not even in death. And in the years that followed, whenever the youngest sisters asked her why she kept 2 names on a single stone, she would smile and tell them only that it was the grave of a very brave man, which was true, and she would say nothing more, which was also true, because the full truth was a thing she had decided to carry alone, the way she had carried everything, quietly, and without complaint. But on the anniversary of that storm, every single year, she would walk down to the cemetery alone, and she would stand between the 2 names, and she would pray, and if you had been close enough to hear her, you would have heard her speaking to both of them, to the boy who lived and to the man who died, and you would have heard her thank Joseph for the 40 years he had given her, and you would have heard her tell Anton, very softly, that the house on the hill was full of light, and that she had finally, after all this time, come home to it. And that is the story of the nun who answered a confession from a man everyone had watched die, and it is the reason I tell these stories here, on the Secret Nun, because there are people in this world whose courage has never been written down anywhere, and if we do not tell their stories, then the silence wins, and the names get forgotten, and the light goes out, and I will not let that happen. Now I have a question for you, and I want you to be honest with yourself, because there is no right answer, only your answer, and here it is. If you had been Sister Clara, sitting in that dark confessional, hearing the voice of the man you had grieved for 40 years, could you have forgiven him? And what would you have said in that moment? And I genuinely want to know, so go down to the comments right now and tell me, because the comments are where these stories come alive, and I read every single one of them. And if this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about the people who have loved you and the people who have grieved for you and the people whose names deserve to be remembered, then share this video with someone, a friend, a sister, a mother, anyone who needs to be reminded that courage and mercy are still real, because that is how these hidden stories travel, and that is how a name like Joseph, forgotten for 40 years, finally gets to be spoken out loud again. And before you go, if you are not already one of us, hit that subscribe button, and turn on the bell, because the Secret Nun is built for people exactly like you, people who know that the most powerful stories in the world are the ones that almost never got told, and I have so many more of them waiting for you. Stories about brave nuns, secret missions, wartime heroes, impossible escapes, and acts of kindness so quiet that only God and a few witnesses ever knew they happened. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening all the way to the end, and remember this, the only thing that ever truly dies in this world is the thing we stop telling, so keep telling the good stories, and I will see you in the next one.